I wanted to start for just a minute, if I could, to introduce you to some of our neighbors. I think we forget sometimes that the people that we elect to office are the people that live next door to us. They are the people that we ask to represent us, and we depend on them to put good government issues in place for us and to listen to us when we have concerns and to act professionally and ethically. And so I am particularly pleased today to be able to introduce you to Mayor Mike Rawlings and the Dallas City Council and the elected officials of Dallas who chose today to come en masse to take time out of their schedule and take a moment to reflect on the ethics of this community. So if I could ask them and the elected officials from this area to please stand, let's welcome them. We are certainly honored to have you here today. Max Weber was one of the principal architects of modern social science. He said that social utility of a politician's calling revolves around these three qualities for success. The first one is devotion to a cause. The second, a sense of responsibility. And the third, judgment, or being attuned to the consequences of one's action. We have a distinguished panel today to talk with you about government ethics, and I will turn it over now to Mike Davis, the moderator for this panel.
Thank you. Once again, I'm not going to do a long introduction of our panelists. Their bios are in your brochure, and I think you'll agree that they're a distinguished panel. Let me start off by offering an observation really quickly, and then let me pose a question. Perhaps a bit of a straw man, or I guess a straw person. The comment or the observation is yesterday when our panelists were flying in, one from the West Coast, two from the Baltimore, Washington area, I guarantee the following conversation happened on the plane. So they turned to the guy next to him, and the guy said, well, what are you going to Dallas for? And Don said, well, I'm going to go talk at an ethics in government conference. And the guy said, what? Ethics in government? Isn't that a bit of an oxymoron? And the observation is that we seem to have more attention paid to public ethics. We have more organizations like yours and your office, yet we have less trust in government than we've ever had before. And so I guess you all have some explaining to do as to why that happened. So the question to get us started. And I wanted to compare a little bit sort of ethics in the public sector and ethics in the private sector. And I think the interesting observation, we heard it on the other panel, is that in the private sector, people worry a lot about relationships and not so much about rules. If you look, for instance, in the oil and gas business, a lot of deals get done on a handshake, and you just have to trust the person you're doing business with. And you have a different relationship. In the oil and gas business, it's probably okay to buy somebody a steak dinner. It's probably okay to go play a round of golf with somebody because you have to know who that person is. And so my question, and I'll start with you, is government ethics too much based in rules and too little based in relationships?
Well, Mike, if you'd ever been to my office, you would know how passionate I am about golf. So we discussed this a little bit last night. I think that there probably has been too much focus on the rules piece of government ethics and really not enough on the leadership piece, which my colleague from the Naval Academy I know will address. So I think that's kind of where the disconnect is, because I think to be an effective leader, whether it's in the private sector or in government, and to be an effective one for any period of time, you have to not only espouse high ethical standards, but you have to embody those and you have to exemplify them as well.
Okay. Yeah. Arthur, would you like to pick up on the leadership part?
Sure. I probably should preface my statements with two things. One is that any opinions that I give are not the official position of the United States Naval Academy, the Department of the Navy, or the Department of Defense. I think that's in a rule someplace that I have to say that.
Yeah.
The second thing I have to say is I'm only here because Roger Staubach, who's famous both in Annapolis and Dallas, asked me to come here to SMU. He said to come to the conference, but then he said to scout SMU since Navy is going to be in town for a football game a week from Saturday. So that's really my ulterior motive for being here. But when we established a center at the Naval Academy back in 1998, it was purely an ethics center. And then the realization began, but what we're really talking about at the Naval Academy is leadership. We want ethical leaders. But we wanted to bring both of them together in an integrated way, which is what we do on a daily basis. Because I agree with Don, it's not just about rules, it's really about leadership. And I often think about Alexis de Tocqueville, who came from France in the mid-19th century to look at America. Why was America the way that it was? And wrote a book called Democracy in America. And he said, America is great because America is good. When America ceases being good, America will cease being great. And that's why I think that we're all in this together, whether it's business or government or nonprofit or the church, doesn't matter. We have to have this higher standard that we are aiming for in all of our endeavors. And ultimately, as been discussed in other panels, it is a culture. And culture is established by leaders. And leaders have to have an environment where they create this type of a focus on doing what's right, even when it costs you personally. Because it's that second part that really becomes the challenge. To do what's right, even when it costs you, even when it costs you your career. And that's what we stress to midshipmen at the Naval Academy. That's their responsibility to our nation. And I've been doing the military since I was 17 years old. And it was ingrained in me as a Marine Corps officer. You are serving the nation. You are being obedient to the Constitution of the United States. And it isn't based on law, it's really based on this idea of leadership, because we owe that to the people who are under this great Constitution that the Founding Fathers came upon. So to me, it is about leadership. And I think, though, it's not just the public servants. It's all of us who have to keep America good so it continues to be great.
Yeah. Judy, talk about what you do in California and how much of it is sort of rules-based and versus leadership for one.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, first, I am grateful for the opportunity to be here, and I want to send a special thank you and welcome to all the members of the Dallas City Council and any of your staff that are here. I served as mayor for 8 years. I know that the job that you do is extremely difficult, and I know it comes with huge responsibility and very few kudos. Lots of criticism, not a lot of love. And I commend you for doing that. I commend you for stepping forward and for taking on the responsibility of being the voice to those who perhaps do not have a voice. So thank you very much for coming today, and thank you to SMU for putting on such a spectacular seminar. Well, when we talk about, actually I'm kind of in between both of our other panelists, because what we do at Santa Clara University, we have an Applied Ethics Center, which was established in 1986. And really our motto is to help people to make everyday decisions. Now, these are everyday decisions that impact their personal lives, their professional lives, their role in the community, their role in business, and in my particular area of expertise, their role in government. And so what we have found is, and I think leadership is a critical component, and that's why I do an ethics and leadership program at our center, but there is such an emphasis on rules that often the values and the leadership aspect of ethics is almost invisible. So I've had many people say, I did not violate a law. Well, you may not have violated a law, but there's a really huge ethical issue here that you didn't address. So I say the law is the floor and not the ceiling. And we really approach ethics in all of the areas, business, government, and healthcare, as being about values as well as rules. So it's not just rules and compliance, it's the values that you hold that guide you to make the decisions that you make. And if I may say that, and I know this is going to probably come up, it's not just about knowing what your core values are and the values of your organization, the values of your city, but it's also about having the courage to actually stick to those values and to speak hard truths. And I know that that is one of the greatest challenges, and probably a reason that many people avoid going into public service, is because sometimes the things that you do are not popular, and we all like to be popular, but when you're in government, you hear it at the grocery store, the library, and at a public meeting often, and it's often not very uplifting or flattering. So we talk a lot about the values that are behind the decisions that we make.
Mm-hmm. There was a lot of talk in the other two panels this morning about stakeholders in the corporate setting, and that, I have to admit, that term makes me very nervous, because I don't know why some of these people should have a claim on the resources of the corporation, but at least that's a clear line of argument that we could have. You know, do we owe a duty to provide health insurance? Do we owe a duty to produce, you know, to serve milk with the Happy Meals instead of soda, that sort of thing? But in the public sector, who are your stakeholders, and how do you decide to whom your duty is owed?
Well, I was thrilled to hear the crossover discussion about shareholders and stakeholders, because typically, in my experience, the shareholders are the people that the business community serve, and the stakeholders are the people that the public sector serves. And actually, I think we have an obligation to stop using those two separate terms and consider all of us stakeholders. We all have a stake in the outcome. And so what we try to talk about in a framework, using a framework for making ethical decisions, is, of course, to get the facts and to evaluate those. And it's always important to me, I tell people who are in public office, and when you get the facts, make sure you get all the facts, not just the ones that support the conclusion that you plan to have. And don't consider just the options that support your point of view. Consider all the options. And then involve the stakeholders. Involve them in the discussions, the conversations. And it's like putting yourself in someone else's shoes and figuring out, I think we have a responsibility to respect those who went before us. So the previous administrations that went before me, because they made a decision based on what they thought was the right thing. So I have to honor that. I have to honor those individuals who are not yet born, who will inherit my decision, who will be the ones that pay the taxes or drive on the roads. And then I have to take into account all of those individuals, whether they're registered or not, whether they are fifth generation or whether they just arrived in the city. I have to consider all of those people as stakeholders. And so it really is looking, if you can, at the common good.
Do you want to pick up on that? I mean, the idea that when you write rules, who's your constituency?
Like I said, kind of back up to the rules values discussion a bit is, and in my agency, the U.S. Office of Government Ethics, our statutory mission is to help prevent conflicts of interest among employees and officers of the executive branch of government. And the rules that we write, because my agency does write the rules, really reflect a certain set of values. They reflect values that have been enacted in certain laws that the Congress enacts. They reflect certain values that we've talked about today. A key component of what we do involves transparency, whether it's in the process by which public contracts are awarded, or whether it's in financial disclosure statements filed by our most senior officials in the government, both political and career. So I think that it's important that the two are not separated, and I think that's one of the things from an educational standpoint as an ethics professional that we try to get people to do, is to really reflect upon what are those underlying values. Why is it that we have certain prohibitions on taking gifts? Why is it that we have in the federal government certain cooling off periods if we leave the government before we can go to work for somebody that our agency did business with? So the question of the stakeholders, there's really two. I mean, ultimately, for public employees like Art and myself, it's the people who pay our salaries. The fact of the matter is that I know that we have both had, really wonderful careers and fulfilling jobs, and we've been privileged to not only be in positions of responsibility, but frankly, we're paid more money than most of the people who pay taxes and pay our salaries. So ultimately, what we owe to them as public servants, and what I owe to them as the leader of my agency, is to help promote that public confidence and trust in the integrity of government. And I know what the surveys say in terms of the Edelman survey and others out there, and I certainly understand, no matter which opinionated cable news show you watch, why people would say that, or you watch the seeming dysfunction on Capitol Hill. But as to the question of government itself, I also think it's important to reflect for a moment on what really is government. Government was the GPS satellite that the cab driver used to find the hotel that he took me to. It's owned and operated by the Department of the Air Force. I bet nobody in this room has given a second thought to the safety of the meal that we're going to have at 12 o'clock. So I think that when we think about government, sure, when we see the turmoil that exists among certain elected officials and the lack of civility, I think it's also important to kind of step back and kind of say, but of those 2 million civilians out there in the civil service that are delivering goods and services, or health care or benefits, or our men and women who are in harm's way serving in the armed forces, to really kind of separate what may be our current disgust for politics with really the value that I think that we do receive from government. So first of all, it is as taxpayers. And then second of all, as somebody who does write the rules, the stakeholders are the members of our armed forces and are the civil servants to whom those rules apply. So there is some modicum of common sense and standards that they really can apply, as Judith says.
Okay. Arthur, I was wondering about the military experience in particular. It seems that it's such a complicated culture. I mean, you hear a lot about, when you ask soldiers why they did what they did, incredibly brave things, they say, I did it for the guy in the foxhole next to me. So how do you, and of course you want to build that cohesion, that loyalty to your fellow Marine, but on the other hand, how do you also get them to understand that they have a larger obligation, that there are stakeholders beyond the guy in the foxhole?
Great question, because I was thinking about this as we were talking about stakeholders earlier. When we emphasized to midshipmen, if I brought a midshipman up here and said, who do you think your stakeholders are, I think their first reaction would be the Marines and sailors that I'm leading, the person next to us. The second one that they would probably mention are the non-combatants, that they're stakeholders as well, particularly in the ethical decision-making realm. The third one would be the civilian authority over them. That's something that's ingrained in our young future officers, that it's a system that has civilian command over the military, which has worked extremely well over the years. And there's bumps in the road with that at times, but it's the right way to go. What we're actually trying to expand them to think about with stakeholders is the folks in this audience. That when they make that ethical decision, when they're in that moment in crisis, it's really not just about the person next to them, because that can lead you down a bad road. but it's all of America standing behind you. I often think of that, if we're allowed to advertise here, the Verizon commercial that has the single Verizon person, and basically the advertisement gives you the impression that if you sign up for Verizon, you get all those people behind you. We want that image to be in a midshipman's mind when they become officers, when they're making that decision. It's all of America, from the West Coast to the East Coast, from north to south, saying, we want you to make the right decision. And one of the images that we actually use is a Norman Rockwell painting from World War II, where there's a young Marine in a garage sitting on a box talking to both young and old with his cover slightly tilted back, obviously telling stories about the war. And what we want to bring forth is, when you come home to tell those stories, you want to be proud of the stories that you're telling, because you've remembered who you're representing when you're fighting in the action at that point in time. So the Marine Corps, I think, is particularly good at this. I'm a little prejudiced this way, but is the imagery and symbology that goes with making those good decisions. It's not just about a PowerPoint presentation with lists and things like that. It's the story and the image that's in the mind when that person is in that point of conflict. So that's how we're, I think, thinking about stakeholders.
Yeah. Actually, that makes me think in Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, he has this almost mythical character, and I can't for the life of me remember exactly how he describes him, but basically it's your good self. Mm-hmm. And he says the way you want to judge yourself is through the eyes of your good self. You want to look out there and say at the end of the day, you know, did I behave virtuously in this environment? And we also hear people, I'm not sure if you give this advice or not, Judy, but I've heard people talk about, you know, when you make a decision, act like the camera crew from 60 Minutes is in the next room. So to what extent does sort of self-esteem or shame, how does that factor into teaching good ethical decisions?
I think some people are driven by one, and some people are driven by the other. Some people would take action out of fear that they might be exposed or be on television, and some take it because that's exactly what they want to do, is to make the headlines. And so for me, it's not about, you know, I've heard people say that, you know, an ethical decision is one that you make when you do the right thing and no one's looking. Mm-hmm. That you would do that if no one was looking. You didn't have any, no one had any idea what you were doing, you're just doing that. And actually, ethics is every single day, and every single day, in almost every way, we make a decision. And it could be as small as if we get a little more change from the grocer than we're entitled to, do we correct that mistake? We're probably really likely to say, I'm sorry, I gave you a 10, and we need to reconcile the difference here. And so if you act every day as the best person that you can be, and that becomes your habit, it will not be a situation of you grabbing your, you know, clutching your chest and saying, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. I've got this dilemma, I don't know what to do. Because we face it every day. We face dilemmas every day. And if you are accustomed to thinking about the values and the virtues that are important to you and that are important in a society and to other individuals, then those decisions, some of them are still not easy. And I know certainly in elective office, when you've got a crowded council chambers and a split audience and people all riled up, it is not easy. But you have your character and your convictions. And if you are able to have the moral courage to do the right thing, even under all of that pressure, to me, that's real ethical decision making.
We talk a little bit about a topic that came up earlier as well, and that's the transparency issue. And you know, Alan Sloan made the great point, if anyone missed it, that it seems like there's a lot of disclosure but very little explanation in private information. But in the private sector, there's a mechanism which is a market, which really forces the disclosure of information. If you don't tell people what's in your chicken nuggets, they're not going to buy them. If you don't disclose your financials, they're not going to give you money. Is there any sort of a comparable mechanism in the public sector? Is there a market for information? Is there pressure to disclose?
Oh, I would say there's tremendous pressure to disclose. In California, in particular, we have a Fair Political Practices Commission that has disclosure forms. Talk about a half an inch.
Yeah, but is that disclosure or is it an explanation?
No, the disclosure does explain. It explains what property you own, what loans you have, who you owe money to, who owes money to you, any gifts that you've received, and exactly who you've received them from. And I think that one step further, I served recently on the City of San Jose's Sunshine Reform Task Force, and they were so concerned about the influence of lobbyists who often are a little bit invisible because that individual may be an attorney, may be the finance chair for a council member, and may also represent a developer. So when that person comes before the council, who are you looking at? Are you know, which hat is being worn at that time? So in order to make sure that there was transparency and an understanding of that, the calendars of each member of the city council, the city manager, city attorney, any of the ranking administrators and their chiefs of staff are available right now online. If you go to the City of San Jose website, and it will list the date of the meeting, the time, who called the meeting, and the purpose of the meeting. And that was really forced upon them because there were a lot of deals being made in other places, and people wanted to know who are you talking to? Mm-hmm. You know, the public only gets one chance, really, through their letters, emails, phone calls, or maybe when they come to a meeting. But it seemed to the people in San Jose that the lobbyists had greater access. And so this was one way to try to explain how the law is made. Well, it's made by a lot of people giving you input, and we'd like to know who those people are who are providing that input.
What about you? Where do you feel the demand for disclosure? Who is knocking on your door saying we want this rule or we want to know this?
Well, I think in terms of transparency, to take a step back in history a little bit, our office was created in 1978 and was really one piece of legislation that was a whole series of reforms in the post-Watergate era that in one way really dealt with transparency. There's the creation of the Office of Government Act. There's mandatory public financial disclosure for the 25,000 most senior people in the executive branch. There's the Freedom of Information Act. There was the Federal Advisory Committee Act. So when the federal government convenes an advisory committee, it's not done in secret. The members are out there, and depending on their status, they may be filing financial disclosure statements as well. So kind of beginning with that, there's sort of this mosaic, if you will, of transparency, I think, in the federal government. And certainly with, I think, the maturity of the internet, websites, and the administration's push for transparency, I think everybody has had the Kool-Aid in the executive branch now, and I think that frankly a number of us think that that's absolutely the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. So the demand comes from the media, it comes from good government groups and not-for-profits that operate not just in Washington but around the country. It comes from private citizens. Since the beginning of this administration, we have released, for example, 3,000 financial disclosure statements from the most senior people in the administration. Those have to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate.
Is there a danger, and this would be a question for anyone who wants to take it, and maybe one that you'll just say is a silly question, but is there a danger that ethical rules in government can be used to exclude some voices? That you set up some ethical rules and you just rule out the participation of people who have a very legitimate interest in being involved in government decision making?
Well, certainly there's been some criticism of the restrictions on lobbyists that were set forth in the President's executive order on ethics, and that certainly has been one. That people maybe have worked very hard to get the President elected. They feel very passionately in a particular area, whether it's about the environment or energy or agricultural policy, you name it, and then it's like, but wait, because I'm a registered lobbyist, you're not going to appoint me? Mm-hmm. It's a legitimate policy choice that I think the administration made. And it's not because I've been asked this question, it's like, well, are lobbyists bad people? No, I mean, you can't live and work in Washington, D.C. and not, know a lobbyist. My wife is a public health advocate. From time to time, she has been a registered lobbyist. She's a lovely person and a wonderful mother. And at this very moment, there is a registered lobbyist advocating forcefully for something that somebody in this room believes in. It was simply a place where the administration could draw a line because lobbyists have to register. And it was to get, again, if we talk about values, the concern really of the President's, which he was on the record with as a senator, was the undue influence of special interests. Not that they should have none at all, but the undue influence.
And I would just add that it is that ability, and particularly with revolving door kinds of issues. I know several years ago there was a story in the paper about the number of former members of Congress who were now registered lobbyists who were working out in the gym on Capitol Hill. Well, now most people won't have access to the gym and to be, on the treadmill next to somebody talking about an issue that they're being paid to lobby for. And so I think that the transparency issue, which some may say would prohibit certain voices, is maybe a little overstated. I think in this area it's best to err on the side of caution because the public already has a sense that there are deals being made, and their perception of the openness and the fairness of government decisions, I think, is at risk. And this is one way to try to, I think, encourage and support public trust.
Okay. Can I just pick up on kind of a related theme, maybe? Your experience in California. It's an interesting place. And one of the reasons it's interesting...
I know you say that with affection.
I do. Because we love all those Californians that have moved to Texas. No, but in California, you've got fairly strict term limit rules.
We do.
And talk a little bit about those and how those have altered sort of the ethical calculus.
Term limits, and I served on the maximum number of years on the city council, and then I was elected mayor, and I served the maximum allowed by our city charter, which has term limits. So I understand this from a personal perspective, and there are people who will argue both sides. What has happened, in my opinion, in California is that term limits have created a state legislature that is run almost entirely by seasoned staff members and special interest lobbyists. You are barely able to find your way around the Capitol before you are termed out. The minute that you are elected to the State Assembly, you know you have a finite term, so you will set up an exploratory committee to run for the State Senate. So I say it used to be maybe a game of chess. It's checkers. And all you have to do is look at the governor of our state, who served as the governor, and then he served as the mayor of Oakland, and then he served as the attorney general, and now he's back to being the governor. Now, is that a bad thing? Not necessarily. However, it does create, I think, an environment where you are less concerned about your legacy and the legacy of your decisions, because you're not going to be there to inherit them. You're not going to be there when the bonds come due. It's going to be somebody else who's going to be there. And so I think that has led to some legitimate concerns about both the lack of experience of some members of the legislature and what can be perceived as undue influence from non-legislators. And let me give you a perfect example. The majority of the legislation that was introduced in California last year was sponsored legislation. That sponsored legislation is a law that is written by and for a specific, it might be an agricultural or healthcare or whatever else it is. It's prepared, researched, vetted, and then handed to a sponsor who will then introduce it. It has nothing to do with that person's constituency per se, but it is that's called a sponsored bill. And the increase in the number of sponsored bills concerns me, because legislation used to come from the people. It used to be a need that was expressed. You as a legislator saw a need, or your constituents told you they had a need, and now it's often just shopping around for somebody who will introduce a bill. And by the way, you may be reelected because you're going to brag about the number of bills you introduced. And I would rather you introduce 3 superior, fabulous, important bills that really are meaningful than 13. But if you say 13, and my opponent's only done 3, who do you think the voters are going to vote for? The productive one, the one that put in 13.
13 bills. Arthur, let's circle back on the military, because this just interests me so much. When most Marines don't have hair as gray as yours, because most Marines have a career after the Marines. So when they leave that military culture and go into the private sector and are confronted with all the ethical challenges we talked about earlier today, give us, what do they see? What do they think? Are they shocked? Do they know how to react? Do they bring the Marine training back?
Yeah, great. Another great question. I'm going to go back to just one thing on the transparency piece. I was just going to mention one thing about that, and that is the military has learned the power of embedded reporters, and that is as transparent as you can get. So if you're ever thinking about wanting to be real transparent, just embed the reporters right in your organization and let them at it, because there's a risk, because a young private's going to say some things you'd probably rather him address in a different way, but in the whole, that transparency has really worked for the military. So I just wanted to mention that. But as far as what happens when Marines leave the active Marine Corps, some of it depends on what level they've left. If they've just served a short time, that's probably different. I'm going to focus on the ones who've been in the Marine Corps for a while, who then go out to substantial positions in all kinds of different arenas. Number one, I find some that really struggle with it because they do see a different culture and they just don't last. They find something else to go to. Number two, there are the ones who go in and really make a difference because they bring some of the Marine Corps culture to that organization, and they find that culture is helpful to any kind of an organization. And then there are those that just continue on to find something that looks more like the Marine Corps, so they'll go teach in a Catholic high school or something like that, where they say, I feel comfortable here, those kinds of things. So you got diversity, but you don't take the Marine Corps out of those people. And again, some don't survive because it's just too hard. Some actually make a difference in those organizations, and some just find a like-type organization where they find the ethical conduct just fits with what they're used to on the Marine Corps side.
Yeah. You're a military guy too. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I did. I started my is this on? I started my professional career as an active duty naval officer. So serving side by side with Marines. So I've always had great respect and affection for the Corps because we're after all part of the same.
You might want to use them.
Technically.
Technically.
Just kidding.
The other thing I would say is, and while Art was talking, I was just trying to do the math in my head. If I had to guess, I would say that someplace between a quarter to a third of the professional staff at the Office of Government Ethics and even some of our support staff are veterans. And the truth of the matter is, they just see the world through a different lens. And since I know that there's most of you are in the private sector, to put in a plug, when that person applies for a job, really at whatever level, even if they just did one tour and got out after their enlistment, they know how to show up on time, they know how to get the job done, they know how to be respectful, they know how to treat people, they know how to follow through. They know when to speak up when they see something wrong or when they think that you're going to make a mistake, which is equally important. So, yeah, I think whether it's the Marine culture or the Air Force culture or the Navy culture or the Army culture, I think that there's great value there, and I don't think you ever take that out of somebody who's had that experience.
Mm-hmm. You know, we've talked about culture in business on the earlier panels. And we've talked about culture in the military service, but there definitely is the ability to create a culture of ethics in any government organization or any nonprofit organization, and it has to start, as I think both of you will agree, it has to start from the top. There has to be a commitment from the top to do this and to make it a priority, to set aside the time, the staff, and the finances to be able to create whatever it takes in terms of training, discussions, hotlines, whatever it might be. And it has to go beyond just the people, if I may say, at City Hall or whatever that organization is. So for example, in our city, it includes that Code of Ethics and Values includes all of our volunteers. It also includes our vendors. And if any vendor is not willing to sign the contract that indicates that they're willing to follow our Code of Ethics and Values, then I don't care what their bid is. Because we got into a situation where we could not break a contract with a vendor who had admitted felony tax evasion, stealing money from us. And I said, we should not be doing business with someone who has stolen money from us. And the city attorney said, we can't get out of that contract. There's no clause that will allow that. So now there is. And I think that it has to be constantly talked about. You have to have practical applications. There are more ethical crises facing the individual who mows the lawn at the city park than there is to a council aide. Because a council aide is generally surrounded by a lot of other people looking at them. The person who's riding the lawnmower is often alone, maybe subject to, well, you're finished here, it's 11:45, I see you've got room in your truck. I have a low-hanging branch here. Could you just cut that off and haul it away for me? Well, you can't use public property and public, taxpayer time to do private favors or jobs for other people. So that's a decision that employee has to make. How, if I want to emphasize customer service, do I say to this individual, I'm sorry, I can't do that? So it's, you know, and it also has to be renewed and reaffirmed. It has to be an act of the city, an act of the board of directors of the nonprofit each year to renew and to tweak it if you need to, but to do that in a public way. And I always say, when I open the website and I do cities across the country, I want to see ethics on page 1 or one click away. Because if it isn't, then it's an indication to me that it's not very important to you.
Let me ask one more and then we'll open it up. And the question I've got is, do you all think the public sector attracts a different kind of people? And that can span the gamut. I mean, you know, the kind of folks who want to go into the military, do they have a set of values that's different than the general population? Or, you know, on the other side of the spectrum, do the people who want to run for office, do they have a different set of values than somebody who wants to run a bank? Arthur?
Now, my cousin Tina, who's here, knows this, but I have 10 children. Probably should answer your question. They're all with the same wife. They're all ours, and yes, we know how it happens. So in case you're worried about us, but their age is 13 to 30, and one of the things I've always said to them is, you've got to serve. Now, obviously, having spent most of my life as a Marine, it seems like the default answer then should be the military, but I don't see it that way. There's a lot of different ways to serve. One of our sons is a college lacrosse coach. That's a place of service. That's a place of sacrifice that has an impact beyond just who you are. Then, you know, and they've all found their various ways. So I'd never want to say that the only people who really have it in them to serve are those that go into the military, because I just don't feel that. But I think we all have an obligation to figure out how we give back or do something bigger than we are. So when I look at Marines, sure, there's a certain type of person that's attracted to that, because the recruiter in downtown Brooklyn is telling that young person, I don't think you're tough enough to come into the Marine Corps. That person goes, of course I'm tough enough, and that's how you get Marines. So there's a certain type of person that you're bringing in. But the reality is that those who are in public service, there is a sacrifice that goes with that, and there's something in the heart that brings that. But I would never want to say that someone who's running a business, who's doing great things, the economic growth of America, that isn't just as valuable as the other. So I think we find our niche. As I've said to my children, find a niche where it's bigger than yourself, and that can find its way in a lot of different arenas.
Judy, you see a lot of people who run for office for all different kinds of reasons.
I do, and I see a lot of people who come into public service to serve as administrators, treasurers, finance directors, city engineers, and I know that those staff people could be making more money at an engineering firm, but they do it for a reason, and generally that reason is because they want to be able to see what they do. They live in a community, and they're pretty proud of the stoplight on the corner of Central Expressway and Great America Parkway, because they had a hand in engineering that. And the people who run for office, in my experience, are people who genuinely care enough to put themselves out there to have inordinate amount of their personal life taken away from them, either through media coverage, through time away from their families, evening meetings. I'm blessed to have a husband of 37 years who is also a public servant in the court system. And if I didn't have someone who understood that I had to every weekend go to a retirement dinner, a ribbon cutting, or one thing or another, I mean, I didn't make any money because we're not salaried. So I couldn't have afforded a babysitter had he not been willing to be home with the children. So it's a sacrifice. And I think generally people go into it. And the only thing I caution someone who's going to run for office is I caution them that it's much harder than it looks. It's extremely rewarding once you, even if you don't win, because you've learned something about yourself and about your community. But I also ask them never to lose sight of who they are, to keep both feet on the ground, to keep going to the library and the grocery store and do your own laundry, because it's when you start to take on a sense of privilege, not because maybe you feel privileged, but because people start treating you differently. They start offering you things, giving you things, treating you in a way that you haven't changed, but your position has changed. And often they do that in hopes of some reciprocal arrangement. And so I loved that, and I hope more people, particularly the young people in the audience, and I hope that they will be inspired to go into elective office.
Would you like to pick on politicians or public servants?
No, not at all. No, I was thinking, is there a difference? I think there's less difference between people who are drawn to the public sector and people in the private sector than maybe we might think. I say that because, first of all, and this is kind of stealing from your playbook a little bit and one of your advanced questions, but that sense about are people motivated by their own self-interest or by more of a collective sense? And I think people have an innate sense to want to belong to something that is greater and more important than themselves. You know, whether it's the church that you choose or the friends that you associate with, or the culture that says, I want to be one of those blue shirt guys or gals at Best Buy, or I want to be a Marine. And so I think that people are drawn to a particular culture and to be part of that. The other thing is, I have no trouble recruiting young lawyers. The last time I put out an advertisement for what we would call a baby lawyer, an entry-level lawyer, I got 800 resumes. And I just thought, well, thank God I'm not having to compete against these kids, because I couldn't do it. So I know that people want to come in on the front end. The other thing is, I've also been privileged to work with political appointees of both parties for several administrations now. And to a person, you talk to them, once they've kind of gotten there, many with no prior government experience, or you talk to them after they left, and they'll say, that was the greatest job I ever had. It might have paid a fraction of what they were making in their firm or their company, but they really felt that they made a difference. And I think they also got an appreciation working side by side with career civil servants, of which I am one, really kind of the dedication and commitment that people in the public sector, again, whether they work in the executive branch or they're staffers on Capitol Hill, really bring to their jobs.
Good, thank you.